Daniel Green is a SORA Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. His research focuses on Yemen, Al-Qaeda, counterinsurgency, and stability operations. He's here this evening to discuss reconstructing Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Daniel Green.
I thought I'd begin with just talking a little bit about provincial reconstruction teams and what they are. After our successful invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the U.S. expanded its focus to include good governance, reconstruction, and development in the countryside of Afghanistan. And as part of that effort, we created these provincial reconstruction teams in a number of different provinces. There were these civil military teams of having maybe a U.S. Marine Corps or U.S. Army Civil Affairs team, which was sort of trained to work with local populations to undertake small development projects. We had a force protection element that was there to protect our base and to go out with us on missions, working with the local government officials into different villages. And then part of that team as well was a State Department political advisor, which is what I was doing, and then a development advisor, mostly from the U.S. U.S. Agency for International Development. In general, these teams were about 100 people. Mine was 93, and we were pretty much it for our province in doing a lot of this kind of work. The General had mentioned as well, after I first served in Afghanistan, I deployed to Iraq in 2007. And in many ways, my Iraq deployment sometimes taught me more about my Afghan deployment than I realized. You may have heard of the Anbar Awakening in Iraq, where the tribes turned against Al-Qaeda. My job when I went there was doing tribal and political engagement for one of our Naval Special Warfare teams. So I had a kind of a thin-looking mustache, but a smile. And I tried to work a lot with the tribes to turn against Al-Qaeda. I worked a lot with the Mayor of Fallujah, the city council. And I saw the city change as part of the Anbar Awakening in just the 6 months I was there. We had 750 security incidents in March of 2007. By the end of the year, of December of 2007, we had less than 80. And the whole place had changed just in a brief time I was there. And it taught me a lot about maybe what success was like, what it looked like and felt like on the street. In a counterinsurgency environment. And so when I went back to Afghanistan, I had a lot of these ideas and concepts in my mind, and I'm going back to Uruzgan in January for an 8-month tour doing tribal political engagement again. One of the things that I think contributed to Taliban's resurgence in Afghanistan, certainly starting in 2006 to 2008, was that by and large, of course, we never addressed the Pakistani safe havens in any comprehensive way. But a lot of our own strategy sometimes reflected sort of a limit to that, like our bureaucracies, the way they're organized, limit how we think about addressing problems. Like bureaucracies will do what they know, sometimes I find, regardless if the problem set requires it. So a lot of our strategy there would be clear out a village and not stay there, or we kick in doors in a night raid and then we would leave. Our development would be big dollar figures for like major towns and things, but small villages didn't see a drop of anything. And this is all because of how we're organized, I think. We're conventionally oriented on conventional wars. We do conventional diplomacy. We like nation states. They're very clean. They're easy to work with. We don't know how to deal very well sometimes with tribally oriented societies that are rural, they're village-based. And the Taliban sometimes are a lot better at that, but they screw things up too a lot. And we take advantage of that when we can. And what I've kind of noticed are like 4 or 5 sort of things we do as a country when we're involved in insurgencies or sort of messy situations like this. One is we tend to immediately underestimate the challenge immensely. And because we don't really truly understand what's going on, and what we do know is filtered through that nation's capital or those privileged groups that have political power but may not be the ones fighting you, we have this sort of misunderstood and skewed perspective on what's going on. But then our initial strategy never is adequate. And then we start to throw more resources at it because we think that's what's required. Clearly we didn't send enough troops, or we didn't send enough aid, so we start doing that. But it's not necessarily about how many resources we throw at things, it's how we're designed. Another thing we tend to do is we use a lot of technological solutions. We think unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, are like a panacea for troops on the ground. We try to do things that minimize our risk, which is great, but the population is always exposed to the threat. You have to be with them 24/7. Another thing too is we have a lot of short-term thinking for long-term wars. Just going back to the Yemen example, I mean, in many ways, if we had, like in Afghanistan, we started to develop what was called an Afghan hands program. So we're saying, you know what, instead of having, 10, we used to say we were in Afghanistan 10 years. Well, it's like, well, we're in there 1 year, 10 times. People have said this. It's better to have a cadre of people who are passionate about the country, who are there for 3 or 5 years. You rotate them, you support them differently, you give them a bureaucratic off-ramp so they can stay in an area. Maybe you want business as usual for France or Britain, but you want something different for Afghanistan and Yemen or Ethiopia or Somalia or some of these other countries that have challenges. So that's just sort of a relentless short-term thinking. I think that's fueled a lot by our elections as well. So just sort of in conclusion, what's the future hold? Obviously, we have a presidential election next year. We'll see how things turn out. I think in general, President Obama is probably committed to continuing the drawdown. I don't think that anything will change much, but if the Republicans win, there might be at least a review of the policy. We'll see what happens. But I think we have significantly diminished the Taliban. You're not seeing the 200, 300 men fighting forces that we saw in 2006. It's much smaller. You see them group up occasionally, but very rarely now. The Afghan army has grown substantially in the last 3 years. The Afghan police they have their problems, no doubt, but that's been very encouraging. Also, there's been a lot of, I think the insurgency now is focusing on assassinating political leaders. It's part of their murder and intimidation campaign, and that's sending the message to the people that the Americans are leaving, we're here. Karzai can't protect his family members. How are you going to protect yourself? And I think that's very worrying. But I think also, our relationship with Pakistan is going through a very necessary review. I think in many ways, we were very naive at the outset of the war about what their views were. I think we were too trusting. I think we sometimes gave them, we believe their complaints about not having enough resources, so we helped them with that. And I think we're at that stage now where I think they just have very different interests than we do. And in many ways, I think we're sometimes subsidizing a covert war against ourselves next door in Afghanistan.
But people are asking, is Karzai the right horse to be backing for the future of Afghanistan? Recognize he's going back. You can opt out.
My body language reveals everything. Well, obviously the people of Afghanistan have elected him. There was a corrupt, imperfect election in 2009. But it's easy to criticize, but it's difficult to say who's the alternative. Absolutely. I think we should focus a lot more on cultivating local leaders, and especially at the district and village level. I think a lot of our approach has been overly centralized. I think sometimes some of the NATO countries are benefiting from Afghanistan mostly from a political standpoint and aren't there pretty much to fight to win. There are different countries. I don't want to try to name countries, but there are some countries that are much better at fighting the insurgency, much more focused on, and others there are others that have frankly negotiated with the Taliban to not have them attack their forces. Their understanding of counterinsurgency is not particularly good. They've not really learned anything from the Iraq experience because it's too politically contentious for them, so they never really studied it. They're incredibly bureaucratic. It's kind of like double the bureaucracy and half the commitment.
What's the role of women in Afghanistan, and coupled with that, what's the role of the women in our military in Afghanistan?
In the rural area where I was, all the women wear burqas. They disappear after 12 or 13 years of age. Our approach to working with them was to be very, very cautious. We would do things on the margins that we could control, like we built that girls' school I mentioned, and once we built that, other districts wanted a girls' school, so incremental steps. I had this idea where I wanted to increase female voter registration and have females running for office for the parliamentary election. So I put together a MedCap, which is a medical civil affairs project at the local school, and had all of our females on the base go to it, and we had the UN come by and talk to the women about the need to vote and to run, and so and then the female voting increased. As you can imagine, we're evaluating Afghanistan all the time in the U.S. government, and every intelligence officer is always pessimistic, and every uniformed military guy is optimistic. And there's always like, how are you guys looking at the same war? Sort of this, I would say the military probably thinks the best, like things have really improved, because at the end of the day, they're responsible for the lives of our countrymen, and they have to implement it.
Well, what do we do to maintain a solid Afghan police force that's not influenced or part of the Taliban?
You know, one of the great innovations when General McChrystal was put in charge of the Afghan conflict was this idea of embedding your soldiers with the Afghan army and the Afghan police. Because a lot of time we would be at our forward operating base and the police would be somewhere else. We would drive out to their place, we'd work with them, maybe go on a patrol, and then we'd go back to our base. And, you know, that's only, you know, maybe a mile distance, but just like, you've got to be with them 24/7. And there, through your own personal example at a very minimal level, they start to become more professional.
What do we gain by staying?
Well, I think we've seen this kind of before. It's called 1992. It's, you know, kind of a butcher and bolt approach, you know, and then sort of transition to benign neglect. I think you're going to go back there eventually. I'd rather do it the right way. The thing is, you know, we're at 10 years now. This might have been a 5-year campaign if not for the Iraq War, frankly. But we can't undo those decisions. We are where we are. I think we're doing the right things. I think we're transitioning probably to a smaller footprint for the long term. But the thing about, you know, defeating al-Qaeda is you can't just think about it as a predator strike. I mean, for example, the intelligence network and the ground game you have to develop that target package to kill that al-Qaeda guy is massive. And he benefits from internal safe havens, places to rest and rearm and re-equip. You have to eliminate those as well. And you have to provide that positive alternative beyond. You know, Islamic radicalism I've found tends to get rooted in people's, there are many reasons for it. This is not the only reason, but one of the big ones is people in desperate circumstances will embrace anything that offers an alternative. And that's what the Taliban offered when people were just tired of the warlordism, tired of the criminality, tired of the instability. And al-Qaeda is not as well organized as the Taliban in many ways, but you think you have to confront it, but do it in a way that's sustainable.
We really need to understand Afghanistan from a perspective of somebody that's been there. We have, and I mentioned earlier, we've had great exchanges of ignorance in some of our presentations in the past. And I do really appreciate having Dan Green come here to talk about his book and about his experiences. And I'm not kidding, I want you to come back. Please join me in thanking Dan Green.